past week, I was in Sweden, because after all, why not, right? And I was speaking to, on Tuesday, literally, what is today, Saturday? Yeah. On Tuesday, I was in Stockholm, speaking to a democracy promotion organization called the International Democracy and Electoral Assistance Program. And there I was in lovely Stockholm. I strongly recommend. It's a beautiful northern European city. But what this organization does is they support the building of healthy democracies around the world. And so I was offered the opportunity to speak to them on this book. And there were people from all over the world there, both online and in person. And so the reason they asked me to speak about the book is because this international community of democracy specialists who do things like setting up elections and writing constitutions or consulting in the writing of constitutions, they are some of the world's experts in the challenges, setbacks, and triumphs in creating stable democratic systems. And so it was a real honor to be able to speak to them and to hear their questions about what's happening in the U.S. And they are genuinely concerned about what's happening in the U.S. The sense that our democratic system is struggling is universally felt around the world. And people, by the way, wherever I travel in Europe, and I travel a lot in Europe, people are paying at least as much attention to our politics as they are to their own politics. Because they are aware that the U.S. plays a disproportionately powerful role in what happens around the world. And that the results of our elections, but not just the results, whether we are able to maintain a healthy democracy is terribly important to either both old established democracies, like in the UK, and newer democracies that are trying to establish democratic norms. So that's my main message in relation to politics today, or to the whole issue of public life, is that our 240-year-old democracy is both beautiful and flawed and fragile. And that just because we have had a democracy, by that I mean a system in which the people elect their own representatives in free and fair elections, in which all votes are counted, in which the results of the elections are respected, in which there is a peaceful transfer of power, in which there is refraining from violence or threats of violence in the democratic system, in which issues are resolved through debate and voting, in which civil and political rights are protected by the constitutional order that is everybody's responsibility to uphold, that this is one of the high achievements in human life. And the fact that we've been able to maintain our flawed but still pretty stable democracy for as long as we have, with the exception of the Civil War, is an example to other countries that are attempting to do the same thing. I am convinced that we became, as Americans, we became kind of casual and took for granted the stability of our democracy. And that the norms, and not just the rules and laws associated with democracy, that the norms would always hold. But it's a truism worth saying. Any good thing that humans can build can be unbuilt by humans. And no matter how old something is, no matter how long it has been standing, no matter how long a political system or regime has lasted, it doesn't mean that it will be there 5 years from now. It survives through the choices of its people. So my message in this book is the following, that democracy, Winston Churchill said, democracy is the least bad political system ever developed among humans. Worse than, how do you say it? I have it in the book. Worse than, what do you say? It's something like just better than every other system that has been tried, something like that. Less bad than every other system that has been tried. And I think that's true, that the combination of the people governing themselves under the constraints created by a constitutional order that is respected by all is a high human achievement. It's at the root of the way of life that we have long taken for granted here. But that it is facing the most serious challenge today to the constitutional order itself that I think we have seen since the Civil War. So in the book, I analyze, first of all, what a democracy is and why it's worth preserving. And then I contrast democracy with authoritarianism. Authoritarian politics is really any political system that, especially I'm talking about where you've had a democracy and then people start weakening it. Authoritarian threats to democracy happen when people no longer respect the norms and rules of democracy. And they are more motivated by an alternative agenda that they think is more important than democracy itself. In an authoritarian political system, think of Vladimir Putin's Russia or Viktor Orban's Hungary, the ruler or the party gradually or rapidly ends popular sovereignty, ends free and fair elections, ends freedom of expression, ends or weakens separation of powers, checks and balances, ends or weakens the independent judiciary, undermines constitutional processes and principles, so that if you're, for example, in Russia today, if you oppose the regime, you will likely end up in prison or dead. The judicial system is a farce. Freedom of expression is not permitted. And what happens in Russia is whatever Vladimir Putin says will happen. That's an authoritarian country. You would think that there would be no motivation that would interest people in giving up a democracy in favor of an authoritarian system. But there is one motivation that is proving very powerful in multiple countries around the world, and I call it a reactionary Christianity. Reactionary Christianity, sometimes called Christian nationalism. I don't love that phrase because I think it's not as precise as reactionary Christianity, but it's maybe quibble. Reactionary Christians in many countries are the population of Christians who look at social changes towards greater diversity and recognition, for example, of LGBTQ people as citizens, or their ability to be married or to hold jobs or rent apartments or whatever. Greater freedom and equality for women. Maybe the movement from a monoculture to a multicultural society through immigration. Or movement of a multiracial society towards more justice and equality among all the races in the society. And other values changes, like maybe a weakening of the Christian loyalty of the population, the spread of religious diversity, the spread of moral diversity and diversity of opinion on all kinds of matters. There is a formula that I noticed and I describe in relation to 7 different countries in the book, in which there is a kind of a population that emerges in countries where a traditional Christian majority used to kind of rule the society and have preeminence over the values and laws of that society. When societies that have been formerly Christian and have been dominated by like Catholic majorities in Poland, or Orthodox majorities in Russia, or evangelical majorities in the US, when diversity increases and the values of that erstwhile majority are challenged, they can come to believe that the society is going to hell in a handbasket, that there's a kind of an organized conspiracy against Christian values, and if they conclude that democracy is consistently delivering results that they don't like, legal changes like legalized abortion or legalized gay marriage, or immigration from multiple countries, or diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, or acceptance, efforts to create acceptance of other kinds of diversity, or women in power in the workplace or in society, they can say God's values and our traditions are under attack, and democracy is part of the problem, because these people who we disagree with so much, they keep defeating us in these elections, and they keep passing laws that we think are not just like unwise, but ungodly and immoral. And so in Russia, one of the things that has kept Putin in power is because he has positioned himself as the defender of Russian Orthodox values. In Hungary, Viktor Orban has positioned himself as the defender of traditional Hungarian Christian values. In Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro positioned himself as the defender of traditional evangelical and Catholic Brazilian values. In Poland, the Law and Justice Party that was just voted out last year positioned itself as the defender of traditional Polish Catholic values. And in the US, part of what has developed on the right, it's not all of the right, but it's part of the right, is we need somebody who will defend traditional Christian values. And we think we've found that person. The thing about these authoritarian, I call this authoritarian reactionary Christianity, because the sense of threat that the democracy keeps delivering bad results, so bad that we might need to fiddle with democratic practices and norms or refuse to accept democratic results. It's one thing to say we're going to organize within the democratic system and try to win elections. It's another thing to say we're not going to respect the results of elections if our side loses. And when that happens, from any direction, you are at risk of democratic erosion and backsliding. So in the book, I try to describe authoritarian reactionary Christianity in 7 different countries. And I try to propose what I call 3 ingredients of a pro-democratic Christian response. And I draw on the best of Christian tradition to do that, or at least I attempt to. And I call on the democratic Congregationalist tradition, especially the Baptists, which as far back as England in the 17th century were making an argument for democracy and organized their churches on democratic lines. I also emphasize the covenantal tradition that began in association with the Puritan movement in England, but spread beyond. And here the instinct was, and what was so threatening about the Puritans to the British Crown, was they said society should be understood as a covenant of all of its members, not as owned by the king. Constitutionalism is a kind of covenantalism, which says that the country belongs to all of the people, and the way we show that we love the country is by being loyal to the covenant that binds us together. The legal form of that covenant is the Constitution. But the moral form of it is all of the norms and practices that go with the covenantal constitutional tradition. Among them, and I talk about this in the book, among them, respect for the results of elections, the refusal to countenance threats or the use of violence against political adversaries, acknowledging the patriotism and value of political opponents, and respecting the civil liberties of all people, including your adversaries, with special attention to a free media, a free press. Being committed to respecting the civil liberties of everybody in the society, including your political opponents and a free press. So I quote political scientists Ziblatt and Levitsky in their book, How Democracies Die. Lovely title. If my title is provocative, that's even more. How Democracies Die. And in this 2017 book, they say democracies die when these norms begin to be compromised. So I make an argument in the book that the fundamental responsibility of Christians in a democracy, especially a democracy whose norms are deteriorating, is to protect the democratic constitutional order itself. That is more important than any specific issue that one might vote on. In other words, it's like we're talking about whether the covenant of American constitutionalism will be preserved, whether election results will be respected, whether election workers can go about their business without fear of intimidation, whether death threats will become a routine feature of the administration of elections, whether political adversaries will be threatened with jail just because they oppose us, whether there'll be a peaceful transfer of power in which everybody respects the results of the election and participates in the handover of power. If we lose that, it really doesn't matter what the inflation rate is or what gas prices are, exactly even, what laws are about this or that issue, because the law itself loses its meaning if the constitutional order on which it is based is eroded. So the Christian enemies of democracy in various countries are those who are so committed to their moral and religious vision, who are so inflamed with outrage at what they consider to be the moral degradations of their liberal enemies, mainly, that they would sacrifice the constitutional order or risk it in order to accomplish their project of pushing back against those values. So you have not just kind of wild-eyed people who are threatening, like extremists, like violence-oriented people, but you also have scholars of various religious traditions in the U.S. who are actually arguing these days that we should set aside our constitutional order and replace it with something like a godly Christian republic. To be led, of course, by them and their kinds of Christians. I think that is fundamentally antithetical to what was set up here. We made the decision about whether we were going to do that in about 1787. But I do think we need to take seriously the concerns that animate some of these folks. One of them is a concern that we're a society that is morally adrift. A concern that we have such values diversity, that we can't agree on anything, even what day it is. A concern that we don't have a shared vision of the common good. A concern that without God, all things are permissible. I think that's Dostoevsky. That we have a vacuum at the center of our values, and it can only be healed with an authoritarian imposition of a Christian political order. And that is the playbook that has worked for Orban in Hungary and Putin to some extent in Russia, and worked for a while to get Bolsonaro elected in Brazil until he was voted out, just barely. And the thing about, if you believe that especially if you believe that you're doing God's holy work in pushing back against moral degradation and decay, then you might say if it's a crusade, then the old rules don't apply. In the book, I describe discovering the language of counter-revolution. Folks in this literature are saying, we have been the victim of a secular revolution that has taken over all the institutions of society. We now need a religious counter-revolution to take back America. That would be business and entertainment and education and government and every sector. And for some who tend towards the more apocalyptic or whatever, it's pitched as a kind of a cosmic battle of good versus evil. And if you're in a cosmic battle of good versus evil, democratic niceties are not as important as winning. So, my friends, what I want to say to you is, if you read this book, you'll see there are reasons why Christians bled and died to create and to defend democracy itself. It's a political order in which, for example, if I'm arrested, they have to give me a reason why. And there are rights that protect me. I was listening to CNN yesterday when the troubled young man who shot up Appalachia High School 40 minutes north of my home was brought before a judge after having murdered 4 people and shot 9 others. And the judge patiently described to this 14-year-old what his rights were. And I was listening and I thought, that's a pretty expansive set of rights. In authoritarian states, you don't get those rights. You don't get the right to an attorney. And the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. And you don't get, the right to know what the charges are, the right to challenge the evidence against you, the right, all of that. You don't get that. So I'm saying, our democracy, according to international observers who do things, I have this in the book, there are observers who give scores to countries based on how their democracy is doing. In the book, I go to Freedom House. You can look up freedomhouse.org. And they give scores from 0 to 100 as to how democratic a country is. And also how well it's doing, whether it's moving more positively or more negatively. And the US score has been dropping for a while. And for these democracy promotion organizations, their whole reason to exist is to encourage and to sustain democracies. And that's my agenda in the political arena, to encourage and sustain democracies, but also to help Christians understand how we got to a place where we supported democracy too. The third tradition, I'll stop here. I named the African American tradition, Christian tradition in the U.S. as a major resource for the defense of democracy. Because the African American tradition, Christian tradition in the U.S. has always known that American democracy was damaged at its core by slavery. And that even the abolition of slavery, sadly because of how Reconstruction ended, the abolition of slavery did not end a racialized Jim Crow social order in the South especially, but also in the North. And the people in the African American churches, in intellectual life, and other just regular people who said, we will not rest until this country actually lives out the meaning of its democratic promise. And those who made that argument in explicitly Christian terms, like Dr. Martin Luther King, are a major resource to democratic advocates everywhere. And so one way, in a longer talk on this, I say, let's move Christians from ARC, authoritarian reactionary Christianity, to DCA, pro-democratic covenantal abolitionists.